Some of you folks who watched the PlayStation 5 DualSense latency analysis video wanted me to analyze the Xbox Series controller's output as well. With a recent update to the controller lag testing software that allowed support for Bluetooth-based Xbox controllers, I'm the phantom out with the results. For this process, I utilized a methodology I'd done for my arcade stick latency analysis as well as the DualSense. Based on info from Wide of inputlag.science, I used an Arduino Mega unit with a USB host shield for hardware. For software, I used Wide's own lag tester program, USB lag, for use in the Arduino program. I would then connect my device to the host shield. Afterwards, I would use an AWG wire with one exposed end on pin 7 of the host shield and another to an input on the test subject. I initially had trouble trying to get inputs to trigger, but was able to get something by having the wire touch this point on the rear PCB. During the process, USB lag triggers 1000 rapid inputs so it can calculate results such as average latency, as well as lowest and highest recorded input. The latest update to USB lag introduced anomalous inputs exclusive to the controller that it triggered during testing, but were discarded. If you want to know more about the process as well as learn to do it yourself, please visit inputlag.science for more info. Before we get to it, do note that this was all done wired through USB-C. I didn't test wireless latency, which required reconfiguring USB lag and the Arduino unit, and I don't have time at the moment to do so. Maybe next time. This controller's firmware was done on version 5.5.2641.0. I also want to mention that the results are pertaining to the controller only, so this is what you might expect if plugged into a PC. When it comes to plugging into an Xbox Series console, I'll discuss more after the results. I did want to compare it to the 2nd gen Xbox One controller as well, but for some reason wasn't able to get a proper handshake with two that I have. If you have an Xbox One controller and can do this test as well, please do let me know on Twitter at @thephantomknot. Otherwise, let's get to it. Upon initial plug-in of the Series controller into the Arduino, it's outputting a polling rate of 250 Hz or 4 milliseconds. On average, latency is at 6.9 milliseconds. 60% of those 1000 inputs came out within the frame of being pressed, with the remaining 40% arriving a frame later. The lowest recorded input on the test was at 1.4 milliseconds, while the highest was at 13 milliseconds. The other graphic is when the polling rate is overclocked to 1000 Hz or 1 millisecond. At least on PC, you could use something like HID USB-F to take advantage of manipulating a device's polling rate. It's averaging out at 5.8 milliseconds, with 66% of those inputs coming in time, with 34% a frame later. Overclock's lowest input was at 1.6 milliseconds, and the highest at 10 milliseconds. How does it compare to Sony's DualSense controller? Since the controller also has the same polling rate of 4 milliseconds natively, it averages at 7.6 milliseconds, with 55% of those tested inputs coming on time, with the other 45% triggering a frame later. Its lowest recorded input was at 4.5 milliseconds, with the highest at 10.3 milliseconds. At least in that department, the Series controller performs better. The overclock side is a different story, however. Sony's controller averages at 3.2 milliseconds, with 82% of those inputs coming on time, with the remaining 18% a frame afterwards. Its lowest recorded input was at 2.4 milliseconds, with the highest at 4.2 milliseconds. The DualSense here is a clear winner. Let's compare to other controllers and arcade sticks on inputlag.science. The Series controller with the results gathered shows that it's in the upper half, but not by much. It's a bit of a bummer that it doesn't get too much of a boost like the DualSense when overclocked. Regardless of settings, it's by no means unplayable. You'll just have to compensate for the latency if used in competitive situations. So some of you might be wondering, even with an overclock, why isn't the Xbox Series controller performing significantly better than native settings like how it is with the DualSense? What about dynamic latency input that Microsoft talked about prior to the Series consoles coming out? Without detailed information from Microsoft nor Sony, it's hard to get a concrete idea of how their control protocols work, but I do want to theorize. I'm assuming when plugged into the Arduino, the Series controller is in X input mode, like if it's plugged in into a PC. It might differ from that when plugged into an Xbox Series console, which according to Will Tuttles' piece on Xbox.com, is using its own proprietary controller protocol. This might differ from the DualSense, where it's likely direct input on both PC and PlayStation 5, but the latter only does a security check as a way to allow the controller to work. Tuttle claims that dynamic latency input on Series consoles, quote, precisely keeps the controller in sync with the game for both analog and digital inputs. The most up-to-date input arrives at the console just before it's needed by the game, unquote. The only evidence so far comes from the Coalition with Gears 5 running on both Xbox One X and the Series X. In Gears' multiplayer mode, assuming the tests were done in ideal display conditions, the Series X's average resulted in 31 less milliseconds compared to the One X when displayed at 60Hz mode. There can be other factors we are not seeing that can contribute in lower lag with the latest gen console. If DLI is a major contributor, however, then it's possible that the Series controller and even the Xbox One controllers gets lower latency when on a Series console thanks to the protocol. That said, there really needs to be more testing to make sure. I also want to see Microsoft do a technical breakdown in the near future. If true on Series consoles, it's cool that the controller and maybe other peripherals can probably enjoy the low latency benefit. It's unfortunate that at least on PC, getting low latency on the Series controller like the DualSense isn't easy. The Windows 10 store does have an Xbox accessories app where you can update the controller like if it's on an Xbox console, but it might be wishful thinking to expect an update to help reduce latency though. If you want to find out more information behind the testing method I'm using as well as other methodologies that you can use to help in doing your own tests, please visit inputlag.science. Until next time, thank you for watching.